South Africa's wild landscapes are home to some of the most iconic species on Earth. Lions rule the grasslands, elephants carve pathways through the wilderness, and giraffes graze the treetops. We need to conserve these precious animals. But wait, this can't be everything wildlife conservation is about. We often see conservation portrayed through stunning images of pristine wildlife, breathtaking landscapes, and uplifting messages. But what lies beneath this surface? Who are the people working in this field? What are the challenges wildlife conservation is currently facing? And how are local communities connected to the wildlife around them? In spring 2024, I spent 4 weeks in South Africa to explore these very questions. To gain a deeper understanding of conservation efforts, I volunteered in wildlife conservation in 2 private game reserves. These reserves focus on restoring previously degraded land into thriving habitats for wildlife. Private game reserves in South Africa are typically owned and managed by large corporations, often based overseas. In contrast, national parks are government-owned and managed. Volunteer opportunities in wildlife conservation projects are predominantly found within private game reserves, making it more difficult to gain deeper insights into the workings of national parks. During my volunteer work, I helped the conservationists in their daily tasks as invasive plant species removal or animal monitoring. The first reserve I volunteered at was the Shamwari Private Game Reserve, located in the Eastern Cape and spanning 250 square kilometers. The second one was Saladi Game Reserve, covering nearly 280 square kilometers and bordering the renowned Kruger National Park in northeastern South Africa. The goal of this film is to go beyond the beautiful wildlife images and showcase the people working behind the scenes. To capture this, I interviewed rangers, scientists, and those working within and around the reserves. As you watch, it's essential to remember that I'm a white European woman engaging with the complexities of wildlife conservation. The stories people share with me might be different from those they would tell another filmmaker. But what does wildlife conservation mean for the people working on the ground?
Wildlife conservation, I think for me, it's looking at the bigger picture of looking at habitat over a single species and just trying to protect or maintain or conserve an entire ecosystem with biodiversity that should be there.
We've been taking over basically everything in this area. So for me, it's just important to conserve these special animals, especially in South Africa, because we have such a diversity of all living beings.
To me, it's a little bit further than protecting and regenerating single species. Wildlife conservation is about protecting and restoring biodiversity and all of the interactions that link biodiversity so that you have some sort of stability, because if you have the stability, then you have a much better chance of success.
So for me, conservation is a lot of things. It's the marketing, it's the landowner devoting his land to the bigger picture, supporting smaller species, it's the NGOs bringing in fundraising, and it's the ecologists looking at the whole picture.
Wildlife conservation means, to me, basically conserving the wild that we are living next to and conserving it for the future generations. And what I want to do is I want to educate people, letting them understand that it's important to conserve animals. And we can learn a lot from animals. I feel like even if we do a small thing, it makes a big difference. I think we all should work together, and many hands make light work.
Conservation to me, it's all about nature and looking after these animals and protecting them, protecting also the plants, and also to teach more people about them, especially in our black community, because it's not well known outside there.
As we've seen, wildlife conservation is approached from multiple perspectives, ranging from safeguarding entire ecosystems and biodiversity to restoring the balance between humans and nature. The positive impacts are undeniable.
So the positive impact of wildlife conservation are that the nature is one of the most natural places where we as humans can be, provides us with fresh air. Being out in nature is something that grounds us, that calms us down. So there's a lot of benefits that come with conservation that many people don't even think about.
Wildlife conservation has so many positive implications, from the human benefit to the spiritual aspect of wild spaces as well, that is really important. And I think if people just live in cities and concrete jungles, the depression rate is probably going to be a lot higher.
Without conservation, we lose serious aspects of human well-being. Then we tend to exacerbate any inequalities that previously exist. So it's kind of a way of also maintaining normal equality between people.
To me, wildlife conservation is important just for our, general biodiversity, but also just to remind ourselves about the beauty of nature and what surrounds us, and can teach us so many things about life and relationships. I think they just encourage us to be better humans.
Aside from the positive implications, wildlife conservation may also have negative aspects.
I think there potentially can be negative implications, but it's more so through the big companies that are involved. Certain big companies, they are taking more than what they should be, and I think more money should be put into the groundwork than it is. A lot of the money that gets donated goes to the top guys.
I think it can be issues because you potentially are more selective about which wildlife is more important, which one should be valued over another. And then there's also so many different debates about how to manage or how to conserve wildlife. And when people don't always agree, you can get lots of conflict.
Because we're already overstocked, even though you're conserving certain wildlife, your vegetation is going to go backwards if you keep on getting more and more animals to please people.
One of the biggest conservation problems in Southern Africa is elephant overpopulation. So in Southern Africa, we actually have too many, but in the rest of Africa, which is like East Africa, there's actually a decline of elephants because of the high poaching numbers there. Now, there's a few ways to deal with overpopulation of elephants. First one is translocation, is where you move it with a truck to a different location or a different reserve. The second one is contraception, and then the other method is culling, which is basically using this round, normally a 375. It's the most cheapest. And what you normally do, you have to go and cull the whole herd. Otherwise, you'll have grieving parents and they might die of a sore heart. And there's a lot of controversy about all of them. They all have pros and cons.
At Salati, we're sitting somewhere at our carrying capacity now. So the last few years, we have started immunocontraception of 80 to 90% of the females on the reserve. So that's just a vaccine. It prevents them from getting pregnant. They're already pregnant. They can still give birth. And that's just to try and level out the birth and death rate, that we're not just having an exponential increase. Because the reality is elephants don't naturally die very often, and they're very long-lived animals. And then when we talk about relocations to places far away, like maybe East Africa, Central Africa, it's not stable enough to take them there, so they might just get shot or hunted out immediately. So it's not very ethical to move them to a place where they don't have a good chance of survival. But also to move them that distance, very, very expensive, very stressful for the animals, and it's getting to a breaking point. But currently there's not much other management strategies to take. Then that's something I think a lot of people don't know.
The high privatization of wildlife conservation in South Africa has led to the creation of many small and closed reserves. This, in turn, requires more intensive management of wildlife populations, such as ensuring a diverse gene pool to prevent inbreeding.
So Salati has a research department which was developed in order to help the management of the game reserve. Because we're a closed system, we have fences all the way around the reserve. That means that we have to manage the game. And in order to do that, we have to know exactly what's going on. So we do many different surveys. The one that we do on every drive is called a drive count survey, and that's where we collect a GPS point and body condition and skittishness of animals. Then we do an annual aerial census, and that's conducted with a helicopter, and we fly grids throughout the whole reserve and just record every animal that we see, and through that we get a fairly accurate population count. So for some populations, we need to pay a little bit more attention to and have more intensive monitoring. So that's rhinos for security reasons, but also the predators and specific prey species, which tend to be more sensitive or occur at lower densities. So for those populations, we like to have heat maps where we can specifically see which areas those animals are utilizing, and then we can have more specific idea of their home range and territory size. So for example, cheetah tend to stick to the fence lines. They like to chase the prey into the fence and also just feel more comfortable on the periphery of the reserve. Lions don't tend to go as close to the fence lines, say our lion pride, which really tends to stick to the river sections. So the best way to have an accurate heat map is to have GPS points more than just the sightings that we have in the field. That's usually through putting a GPS collar on them. And we put those collars on our key individuals, so that's mostly predators, lion, cheetah, wild dog, as well as elephants and other key wildlife populations. For elephants, it will include matriarchs and then also big bulls. So the other day we were trying to find the biggest elephant bull we could find, and we found the animal we were looking for. He was darted with a helicopter, and then the ground team came in to stabilize him and perform the collaring operation. When we have the animals down, we try and collect as much information as possible while we have the opportunity to do so, and that includes getting a DNA sample. So we take a little bit of an ear tissue sample as well as tail hair, just to have in our DNA bank if we would like to analyze it at some point. So in addition to the DNA samples, we try and collect as much information on the size and all physical attributes of the animal. So we try to have a relatively consistent effort of our camera traps throughout the reserve, which is typically 25 to 30 cameras, depending on how many the elephants have smashed that year. So every 2 weeks we go and collect the SD card, and then those photos get uploaded to a processing software, and that is where we manually enter what's in each photo. The camera traps really allow us to have eyes and ears out all across the reserve 24/7, day and night.
Now that we have met some of the people guiding us through this film, you might be wondering why so many white people are involved in conservation work in South Africa. At least, that is how I felt at first. This country's complex history, shaped by colonialism and the legacy of apartheid, continues to shape modern conservation efforts. Apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination, primarily targeted the black working class through systematic social injustices from 1948 to 1994. Unfortunately, this racial inequality remains evident in conservation today, where the field is predominantly controlled and represented by white individuals. Conservation efforts in many African countries have been shaped by the establishment of protected areas under the model of fortress conservation. This approach often led to the displacement of local communities, forcing them into areas without access to essential resources while restricting their ability to benefit from the environment. However, this issue isn't unique to South Africa. We have observed it in many other regions around the world as well.
Land in South Africa has an interesting history. During apartheid, a lot of the land was parcelled up round here, and it was then reallocated, while the fertile land that was useful for farming had already been allocated to white farmers. Communities in this region will have been excluded from different resources.
Before apartheid ended, towns were already separated into coloured areas and Xhosa areas or Zulu areas, depending on where you are in the country. So after apartheid ended, it kind of stayed the same. So there are different cultures in South Africa, and in most cities you will find a town with its usual businesses, and on the outskirts are usually townships where the majority, I would say, more impoverished people live.
Behind romanticized wildlife conservation, there is the pressing broader issue of racial injustice within the field.
Local communities here in Africa suffer definitely a different challenge. I mean, they're on the poverty line. Their challenge is feeding their family, educating their family, putting clothes on their family's back. So for them to care about conservation, unless it directly benefits them, there's definitely less of a drive for that. But often they understand that these wild areas support them with a job, support them with red meat protein from the hunting. International hunters, they come and they shoot an animal and they can only take home the trophy or the cape, and the rest of that meat goes to the community.
Obviously, there's communities that get involved within the wildlife sphere, but I think as a whole, the communities actually are detrimental to the wildlife. A lot of communities are coming from very poor backgrounds, they don't have the right education, and they are trying to find a living. They've got to support their families and support their children, and by doing that they often get involved in things like poaching or snaring on properties. And if I was in their shoes, I would do anything to feed my children, so I don't blame them.
Not getting jobs and also doing stupid things because they are not educated about these animals. So other people will find them poaching the animals and also killing them for traditional medicine purposes, which is not scientifically proven. So that's because they are not educated and not given the chance to ask or learn about these animals.
High poverty rates around many protected areas often drive local communities to engage in poaching, whether for financial survival or simply to put food on the table. While this poses a serious threat to wildlife and conservation efforts, it is important to recognize that for many, poaching is not a choice, but a means of survival. Rather than seeing it solely as an environmental issue, poaching should be viewed as a socio-political challenge, an act of desperation and, at times, a form of protest against economic inequalities and limited opportunities. In South Africa, historical land reallocations and ongoing segregation have marginalized many communities, resulting in significant poverty. Generational trauma from historical displacements and racial injustices rooted in colonial practices have resulted in profound inequalities and ongoing challenges. The 1980s saw a shift towards community conservation, aiming to involve local communities and ensure them to benefit from conservation efforts. Most contemporary conservation organizations strive to engage neighboring communities and improve their livelihoods.
Often for wildlife conservation, you do have to use up land that people could have used for other purposes. So there is a little bit of conflict between the needs of people versus what the wildlife needs. They can be reduced, and Shamori does their best to do that. So do most game reserves. They don't just think about the wildlife, they think about the people too. If you don't think about the people, they are going to have a negative view on wildlife and can often harm the wildlife that you're trying to protect.
Wildlife conservation is very important, especially for our communities. So the volunteers who are coming all over the world, they go to our communities. So they do go to the school and then help us in donating some books, clothes.
Today we are in Huria Daycare Center. It's a daycare center that's registered for babies who are just out of nappies. Most of their parents are at work, so they pay about 30 Rand a month. We were here 6 years ago. Today we are doing some painting on the outside porch. The class is busy fixing the fences. We're going to sort out the lights and electricity. In South Africa we have load shedding, so there's hardly electricity most of the time. A lot of the places, the yards are exceptionally dirty. There's no more furniture. They disappear to people's houses, and at least here things are sort of looked after. So yeah, lots of stuff still to be done. We've donated a water tank. There's also no water in town. The borehole has not been activated for many years. Every time when it has been activated in my time here, somebody has stolen some parts of it. So the town gets its water from the Addo region, and it either comes through pipelines, which is very unreliable, or it gets brought through by water trucks twice a week.
The displacement of local communities often leads to exclusions of natural resources like water or food. This further exacerbates existing challenges. On one side, poor communities living near reserves often lack basic necessities and may therefore resort to poaching to support their families. On the other side, large game reserves with luxury lodges cater to tourists, reinforcing colonial-style safaris and exacerbating racial and social inequalities. This situation, sometimes referred to by scholars as the new green apartheid, has persisted and, in some cases, worsened since the end of apartheid.
South Africa simply doesn't have a lot of jobs. So that causes a lot of issues with regards to poverty. So lots of people rely on the natural resources. It's like 80% of people plus are using these free resources for literally just for food for themselves and their families. Communities won't have access largely to safe running water, so running water that you can drink, running water that you can wash in. So you have people climbing over fences, trespassing, putting themselves at risk, not for loads of cash and poaching. It is for subsistence. There should be fair and equal access to water for really basic human rights.
I'm part of the Concerned Citizens of Paterson movement, and once a month we meet and we talk about problems in town. Mostly the problems are police orientated, that the police are part of the problem, part of the crime syndicate. And yeah, people are now stealing water because people are actually desperate for water now, which is crazy. It's something that should be free.
We are a poor community, so wildlife is really a lifesaver for us. If they come here, they bring a lot of food for our dogs, our kids, and our children. They appreciate it so much. Our place was in a bad stage because the hooligans, they mess here, they break, and they took all our stuff. So those people, they came to us and they help us. So there is a huge change here.
While wildlife conservation can offer economic benefits to local communities, particularly through tourism and the support of conservation organizations, these efforts often fall short of addressing the full scope of local needs. To ensure lasting success, it is crucial to meaningfully integrate local communities into conservation efforts, whether by creating job opportunities or involving them in the management of protected areas. Although many such initiatives have been launched, they frequently fail to meet basic needs or provide sufficient financial support.
So because we get a lot of conservation volunteers here, people always leave some shoes that are broken or some clothes that has paint on it from the day. And then eventually we started having bags and bags full. And then I realized that this is the only way that we can make money for the project. So once a month we pick a town and we sell the clothing for very cheap. So that is how we make our money. In the beginning, when I first started here, we used to do town cleanups when I didn't really have a lot of money to spend. I would still like to bring my international volunteers out to townships so that they can maybe appreciate a little bit more what they have back home. So we used to clean the streets for people, and people would want to join in from the local area, and as soon as they realize I have nothing to give them, then they walk away. So we ended up cleaning the towns for them. I used to make the big mistake of getting kids involved, and at the end you'd hand out lollipops and it has plastic wrappers on and a plastic stick. And as soon as you've done a little bit of an education on what trash does, I ended up picking up the wrappers from the lollipops as well. It gets extremely overwhelming. It takes a lot out of you, and I don't think people realize how hard it is to actually get these projects going. And maybe 90% of them fail, but that 10% kind of makes it worthwhile.
High unemployment rates have led to widespread poverty in many townships, often fueling crime and deepening social challenges. Compounding these issues are the historical displacements of local communities, which have left many residents unable to interact with the wildlife they are living right next to.
Unemployment, I can't tell you because there's no real statistic, but I would say close to 70%, if not more, unemployed. I think way more. So copper, anything that could be sold for scrap metal gets stolen. So you have to make sure your items are plastic or non-stealable, basically. Even people that grew up here, that was born here and are now dying from old age here, has probably never been on a game reserve before. Even though we are right next door, there's a very lack of opportunity of people getting out and learning.
I just drove by Edo National Park and I see the lions and the animals there, but I was never in the park.
The love for animals, I wouldn't say is there as much. You can see it in the pets. They have a dog is in your yard to protect your yard, to bark, to make a noise when somebody breaks in. And very few people, it's mostly those where both parents have jobs, where they'll actually treat the dog like part of the family. And I know that because I did a survey. And for people that were unemployed, the main food source was pap, which is maize meal. and potato peels. I found a lot of dogs where the tips of the ears are cut off, and they believe that if they bleed the puppy out, it will bleed the rabies out. So there's a lot of superstition in town, a lack of education, and the animals are not well looked after, but it's understandable. People can't even feed themselves. So lots of starving people, but also starving animals running around in town.
While the community conservation initiatives offer various forms of assistance, they seem to provide more immediate relief rather than long-term solutions for improving overall living situations. The deep-seated social and racial inequalities, coupled with high unemployment and widespread poverty, make it challenging to achieve substantial improvements. Addressing these issues requires not only the efforts of non-governmental organizations, but also national and international political intervention to confront and resolve these persistent disparities. Unfortunately, I was unable to interview community members to share their experiences with wildlife conservation and highlight their livelihood to provide a better understanding of their challenges and traditions. Some of the conservationists, however, were able to talk about some local practices. Traditional medicine, not only in South Africa, often relies on the use of wildlife bones and body parts, which presents challenges for wildlife conservation.
In South Africa, we have traditional doctors, which are also known as sangomas in the local languages, and they use a lot of traditional medicines, and the way they go about getting animal remains is horrific. They go through a lot of poisoning, they go through a lot of snaring, which is very detrimental to the wildlife.
Not just in Southern Africa or Africa, but anywhere in the world you have traditional medicine or these very deep-rooted cultural beliefs, whether they're true or not. The big one is rhino horn, but that's more of the Asian markets. It's very difficult to combat that when it's very deep-rooted, but I think there are ways around it, and I think education is the best way.
Shamwari's just started releasing vultures, and we've started a breeding program. It's quite well known that local communities don't get along with vultures too well. It's a misconception that the vultures are going to be taking livestock when we've got a reserve full of animals, but the conflict is there.
It seems to have taken an awfully long time for traditional knowledge to be fully incorporated into active research and conservation.
Relying solely on education, which often reflects colonial perspectives and the dominance of privileged conservationists, may not be the most effective approach in combating problems between traditional practices and wildlife conservation. Instead, respecting and integrating traditional knowledge into conservation efforts is crucial. This approach helps to balance cultural perspectives and counters the narrative that blames local communities for wildlife declines, often portraying them as ignorant or lacking environmental values. While integrating traditional knowledge into conservation is a slow process, it is essential for achieving meaningful change and promoting equality between different forms of knowledge. Observing the inequalities and poor living conditions of communities around protected areas has led me to seek deeper insights into how conservationists plan to address these issues and improve living standards.
Yeah, it's a very difficult challenge, really, balancing the community's large areas, because, there's 1 million people living on the doorstep here, and we can't give them all a job. So, we need to look at the ways we can use tourism, community projects to uplift the communities around us in order to support them. Here at Salati, we've got a really cool Bush Buddies program, bringing kids back into the field where they can engage with wildlife, understand these wild spaces that are on their doorstep. But what is important for us is we use the community as a buffer to protect the reserve, and that's only going to work if the reserve supports the community and they see the reserve as an asset and a value to them.
Actually go out there into the communities and do some activities with the community to show them how important these animals for the wild, and also not to hurt them or mistreat them.
Without significant reforms in both international and national policies and a shift away from often privileged Western viewpoints, the situation could worsen. To address these issues, wildlife films and conservation education programs must offer a more accurate and inclusive portrayal that recognizes communities as integral to successful conservation. Similarly, tour operators should highlight the social realities and challenges faced by these communities. But apart from that, what else needs to change in order to improve wildlife conservation?
I think it's mostly just collaboration with community members, with chiefs, with the government, with private organizations.
I mean, apart from the obvious that we need a lot more money and funding in it, I think we need a lot of new ideas.
Unfortunately, money is something that's extremely important to wildlife conservation. That's why game reserves need fancy lodges so that people can bring in large amounts of money for it to be used on wildlife. We need to buy land surrounding us, we need to fix fences, we need to pay for vehicles, we need to pay salaries.
If more people cared about nature, and it's not necessarily about people donating money to wildlife conservation, you can actually just make small differences in your backyard by choosing cardboard over plastic and not allowing harsh chemicals to get into your local river systems, because that can start that chain really down low for biodiversity. If every single person makes small changes and small action in their life, it can make a bigger impact overall globally.
I guess one of the main things, besides funding, everyone wants money. What I think we really need is more cohesive work between different organisations. There needs to be more of a humanities application, especially between people. Everyone has their own agenda, but they need to consider everything. Only then will you be able to get some sort of targeted movement, because there's no point unless you have everyone on board.
In general, education will be the main thing that we need to try and push towards international people, not just locals, and then just literally try to get reserves as big as possible to try and get wildlife and original habitat back.
Now that we have explored so many different sides to wildlife conservation and the interconnectedness with local communities, I wanted to know what the people we have encountered throughout this film hope for the future.
I hope that people have an understanding to conserve, and once we have that understanding, we'll maybe be able to see those animals that are endangered in the future.
My big hope is that there is this project called the Indalo project. So it is to connect all of the neighboring reserves into one. And that would be something very interesting, to create a reserve so big so that it will just create more of a natural environment rather.
What would be great and what I really hope for is more active conservation, because we know what the problems are. The knowledge gathering phase for most things is at a stage where we know what needs to be implemented. What I hope for is a more cohesive strategy, or like a way to be able to start helping rather than knowledge gathering. That's the only way that we can truly start to conserve things.
I would say to reach more to our communities and to help them. If we can work hand to hand, especially with our police, so that whatever we do provide for our communities will stay safe there.
I hope that we do notice that there needs to be a significant change, and I hope that my children and my grandchildren will be able to experience the things that I can experience, that they can go to Africa and they can see a wild elephant, that I can then show my offspring and say, look, this is what we've done, we've managed to change the world.
I wish that every person on this planet had to go into the wild for 2 weeks. I think the world would be a much better place. Once you've experienced this on your own, it's mind-blowing.
Tourism is always big in this part of the world. Everyone wants to come on a safari and see lions and elephants, and it's amazing. And I think creating more awareness around not just going on the safari, but actually learning a little bit more about the small stuff or how this impacts the community. And it's not necessarily the prettiest thing to hear or see always. So I think just having more authentic education to tourists who come here is really valuable.
So what I really hope is that wildlife conservation gets to continue to adapt, continue to grow. More people become interested in it, especially the younger generation. I hope that people can learn and it becomes a lot more popular and cool to be part of wildlife conservation. And ultimately, I hope that one day I can bring nieces and nephews so that they can also enjoy and actually be able to go and see a rhino, see a cheetah, see elephants in all that they can be, rather than in pictures at the museum.
For the future, I hope to see a lot of more Black community people working close with animals and learn more about the animals. I want to see our rhinos being protected. That would be very wonderful to see them getting a lot of animals living freely on the planet.
I hope the future holds more understanding across the globe for wildlife conservation. It's difficult to say for people who are not privileged enough to appreciate it. I mean, if you have to worry about what's going to be on your table for dinner tonight, then you're not going to be too worried about an impala running across the field. So if we could almost equalize all living situations for humans as soon as possible, or at least get to a more standard level, then I think everyone would appreciate wildlife more.
Throughout this film, very contrasting perspectives on wildlife conservation become evident. On one side, there is a more colonial approach, where game reserves highlight the beauty of nature for privileged visitors, and conservationists emphasize detrimental behaviors and the needs for education. However, it is crucial to consider the other side as well. Local communities face serious challenges, including insecurity, unemployment, and poverty. To truly address conservation, there must be a stronger demand to bridge the gap and improve living conditions for those who live alongside these protected areas. Meaningful progress in wildlife conservation clearly depends on addressing inequalities, racial segregation, and both historical and modern injustices, and moving beyond discussions towards implementing actionable solutions. Incorporating both traditional knowledge and local community members in wildlife conservation by creating job opportunities and involving them in the management of protected areas is essential for the long-term success of conservation efforts. This approach, known as community conservation, holds great promise but still has a long way to go. Conservation must be about more than just protecting animals. It's about fostering and restoring the deep connection between humans and the wildlife they live alongside. It is crucial that those facing socio-economic hardships are not overlooked in current conservation narratives.